Good evening. I'm Dr. Vincent Baycoat. I direct the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics, and thank you for coming to our event tonight. The event isn't only sponsored by the Center for Applied Christian Ethics, but also by the One Campaign, our Politics and International Relations Department, and our Hunger Program. We're very excited that Michael will be here with us to talk about a topic that many of us have been thinking about. You're going to have the opportunity at the end to learn about some information on the tables back there. But to introduce Michael, let me invite Will and Lindy, our student leaders from our Student One Campaign, to come introduce Michael.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. My name is Lindy Turing, and I'm a sophomore international relations student here at Wheaton. And I'm Will Braden. I'm a political science major, sophomore student as well. So for those unfamiliar, ONE is an international nonpartisan grassroots advocacy organization focused on fighting extreme poverty and preventable diseases in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So last May, Will and I had the privilege of visiting the One Campaign headquarters in Washington, D.C. with the Wheaton in Washington program. After witnessing the partisan divides that have torn our country apart for the past few years, we were so inspired to see how the One Campaign is transcending political tribalism by uniting politicians to fight for human needs. We wanted to find a way to join One Campaign's mission to end extreme poverty in our lifetime and to support developmental initiatives through advocacy actions that we could perform already as college students. So that day, the two of us, along with two other students who were on the program, Erin Dochi and Samantha Wolf, signed our names down to start a chapter here at Wheaton College. Now we've gained legitimacy as a club on campus, and we are also an official branch of One Campus here at Wheaton. So as Wheaton's One Campus leaders, we seek to engage political leaders supporting bipartisan legislation to create sustainable economic futures in the developing world. As a campus chapter, our mission is to raise awareness, encourage discourse on international development policy, convince our political leaders to pass laws and policies that combat extreme poverty and preventable diseases, and represent Wheaton's mission and heart for the world as followers of Christ. After the lecture and Q&A session, please come back and join us at our table to learn more about ONE and our efforts to catalyze action among Wheaton College students. Actually, tonight we'll have an opportunity to write letters of advocacy to our congressional representatives, urging them to fund the international affairs budget for the fiscal year 2020. This budget goes to help life-saving developmental programs, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other regions, that provide effective, life-saving healthcare, improved educational opportunities for women and girls, and further ONE's mission of preventing extreme poverty in our lifetime. We would so appreciate a couple minutes of your time just to talk with you face-to-face, and also joining us at the table will be Wheaton class of '86 alumnus Michael Gerson. Michael Gerson serves as senior advisor at ONE. He's also a nationally syndicated columnist who appears twice weekly in the Washington Post. He's the author of Heroic Conservatism and co-author of City of Man. Until 2006, Gerson was a top aide to President George W. Bush as assistant to the president for policy and strategic planning. Prior to that appointment, he served in the White House as deputy assistant to the president and director of presidential speechwriting and assistant to the president for speechwriting and policy advisor. Let's thank him tonight for joining us.
Thank you. Oh, I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks. No, that was really great. It is so good to be back home at Wheaton on behalf of ONE. Wheaton is the place I gained an education. I made enduring friendships, and I gained a vision of what evangelicalism has been and what it might be again. I'm truly grateful to this place for setting the direction of my life, and I'm always honored to be here. Our topic this evening is the common good, and that can sound a little too high-minded, a little too Wheaton-y, but I've recently learned about a different Wheaton connection to the common good. You might be aware, or perhaps not, that some recent Wheaton grads have just opened a new wine and cocktail lounge in Glen Ellen, and it's called, and this is true, the Common Good. Now, this is fairly new to me, Wheaton grads opening cocktail lounges. I suppose I'm for this. After the week we have just had in Washington, I'm for any safe place to get a stiff drink. Maybe not beer. Maybe we should all stay away from beer for a while. With all the focus on college moral failures, I will tell you that my experience at Wheaton was shockingly virtuous. So resolutely bland that I'm almost ashamed. I had one roommate who once spent 18 hours straight in the library, that's true. Another one who organized half the extracurricular events on campus. Now, I did have another friend, a Wheaton student named David Sims. David was fond of sleeping, and he did make up small signs. One said the word, and the other said the library, and he would place them in rotation over his bed. So when asked what he'd been up to, he could truthfully say, spending time in the word, or the library, depending on the day. As I thought of what to cover tonight, I was a little depressed because most of the things I could tell you about politics right now are depressing. And I'm going to start by talking about some trends that make the pursuit of the common good difficult in our time. But I'm going to end on a hopeful note, with a miracle of moral purpose that I have seen with my own eyes. So I hope you'll bear with me a few moments. One thing I don't intend to do is to talk much about President Trump. People think I've become obsessed with him and are tired of it. My wife has imposed a strict rule. For every mention, there is a $20 fine. And she is well on her way to buying her Range Rover. No, I want to talk about some ideas beneath our politics. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I was a theology major at Wheaton College, Bible and theology, testing how much my parents could pay the most money for the degree with the least earning potential. And now with my son in art school studying painting, my father has his revenge. I somehow found my way. I worked on Capitol Hill in the media on 3 presidential campaigns, had a wonderful period of government service as director of speechwriting and policy advisor to President Bush in that brief historical window when there was a Republican administration that would actually employ me. While working on the global AIDS issue at the White House, I got to know Bono of U2 a bit. He invited me to the first rock concert I had ever attended, and it was loud. Soon afterwards, my wife and I had dinner with Bono, who is a very idealistic and principled man. After dinner, my wife told me, "You may be idealistic and principled, but it would also be nice if you were rich and cool." I have also met Angelina Jolie. My wife was there too, I think. Or so she tells me. Now I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, living under the tyranny of 2 deadlines a week. I actually did a column before 8 this morning. I'm a senior advisor at the One Campaign, as was described, an international grassroots organization founded by Bono and dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable disease. My day job is in the political world, and I sometimes know the people involved in the news. I covered the Kavanaugh hearing for PBS on Thursday. I worked closely with Brett Kavanaugh for 3 years at the White House. I know him very well. I know Jeff Flake very well. I know Senator Chris Coons very well. I generally like the people involved in public service, who often make tremendous sacrifices of time and money and reputation. But almost uniformly, when I talk to political figures, they complain of a political atmosphere more toxic than they can remember. They complain of large forces that seem to make our divisions deeper and more bitter, and they feel frustrated in their ability to serve the whole, to serve the common good. Let me briefly mention 3 of these trends that challenge our best intentions. First, we live in a landslide country, just with different outcomes in different places. Now, here's a figure that I found interesting. In the 2016 election, 80% of counties in America gave either Trump or Clinton a landslide victory. In the 1970s, that figure was more like 25%. We live in increasingly homogeneous political communities in silos of the mind. Polarization is not just a function of Washington dysfunction. Americans are self-segregating in a variety of ways, politically, geographically, culturally. And our views of the opposing camp have become progressively more negative. Here's the conclusion of one recent Pew study, quote, "These days, Democrats and Republicans no longer stop at disagreeing with one another's ideas. Many in each party now deny each other's facts, disapprove of each other's lifestyles, avoid each other's neighborhoods, impugn each other's motives, doubt each other's patriotism, can't stomach each other's news sources, and bring different value systems to such core social institutions as religion, marriage, and parenthood. It is as if they belong not to rival parties, but to alien tribes." There are many reasons for this state of affairs, which would take a lecture series to explore. The ideological sorting of the parties is a powerful factor. Conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans are increasingly endangered species, and this ideological divide between the parties tends to turn every issue into a culture war battle. There are other factors, the growth of partisan media, including cable TV and talk radio outlets, that provide not information but ammunition. There's the power of technology to mobilize factional interests, and that allows people to live in filter bubbles. There's gerrymandering, leading to the constant fear of politicians that they might be primaried for lacking ideological purity. The result is the careful weaving of cocoons. One story illustrates this for me. David Wasserman of the Cook Political Report tells of meeting with a group of young Democrats in a wealthy suburban part of Northern Virginia. In the course of his presentation, he made reference to Cracker Barrel voters that live in counties with Cracker Barrel restaurants, which went to Donald Trump by 75%. "Excuse me," interrupted one of the young liberals. "You must have it wrong. Do you mean Crate and Barrel?" This is an extreme form of a cultural bubble, a life arranged by fate and choice so that other ways of life are unimaginable. When Americans start seeing their fellow citizens as enemies, a line is crossed. Our democratic institutions are designed for disagreement. They are undermined by mutual contempt. Unfortunately, as we've seen, the incitement of contempt can work politically, at least in the short term. We've seen the kind of leadership that fans frustration into fury. The politics of polarization can carry an election and wreck a democracy. The largest problem with political tribalism is simple. When the other side is evil, then compromise is not only hard, it is wrong. Compromise and comedy become not virtues, but vices, and sand is thrown into the gears of government. It's hard for people who care deeply about public events. It is hard for me, but resisting polarization must start with an adjustment of attitude. I want to borrow an idea from the Franciscan priest, Richard Rohr. He says that the prophetic stance is that prophets live, quote, on the edge of the inside. They fully belong to a community, but have just enough distance from that community to see it with clear eyes. To live on the edge of the inside, Rohr said, is different from being an insider, a company man, or a dues-paying member. Yes, you have learned the rules, and you understand and honor the system as far as it goes, but you do not need to protect it, defend it, and promote it at all costs. It has served its initial and helpful function. You have learned the rules well enough to know how to break the rules without really breaking them at all, not to abolish the law, but to complete it, as Jesus rightly puts it. A doorkeeper must both love the inside and the outside of his or her group and know how to move between these two loves, end quote. We should strive to be doorkeepers of our ideological traditions, committed but not blind to our commitments, knowing both the inside and outside of our group and finding sympathy for both. So polarization is the first trend. My second point, which is shorter, is related. No matter how good we think our political case, we are probably not going to argue our way to unity. Social science has revealed something I find unsettling. The more knowledge that partisans have, it turns out, the more stubborn they become in their beliefs. People tend to accept information that confirms their existing convictions. The largest problem is not so-called low-information voters. It is people who use their brain power to support the views of their tribe. So Republicans, for example, who have higher levels of scientific knowledge, are actually more skeptical of global warming, even though I think the evidence for climate disruption by any objective standard is compelling. For evidence of this phenomenon, look no further than 10-year-olds playing soccer. When there's a close disputed penalty call, parents on the sidelines have a strong tendency to really believe in the call that favors their child's team. Or another example, when social scientists showed aerial pictures of Trump's inaugural crowd and Obama's crowd, which was clearly bigger, to voters, many who supported Trump thought his crowd was larger. They were not lying. They were demonstrating that group commitments often have more power than reason. Confirmation bias can not only be humorous but destructive. In a 2006 survey, a majority of Democrats agreed that it was likely or somewhat likely that George W. Bush was complicit in the 9/11 attacks. In a 2015 poll, 43% of Republicans believed that Barack Obama was a Muslim. One gets the impression in both cases that partisans would have agreed with any polling description perceived as negative. Any stick is useful that comes to hand. How do we confront this deep human tendency? I think it begins by being willing to call out your own side, to make a fair judgment on the penalty call no matter who it benefits. Calling out the other side really doesn't work. When Barack Obama criticizes conservatives or when Trump criticizes liberals, views are only entrenched. Be an advocate, even be a partisan, but show some intellectual honesty. It has never been more important. I've met some politicians willing to do this. Consider Senator Jeff Flake's role in the recent determination to go to the FBI for further information. And politicians like former Senator Bob Dole have a habit of calling it like it is. In 1996, I remember, then Speaker Newt Gingrich had a 16% approval rating in the polls. At one event, he turned to Dole and asked, "Bob, why is it that people take such an instant dislike to me?" Dole replied, "Newt, because it saves them time." At least that's the way Dole tells it, who I worked for during his presidential campaign in '96. He has a famously sharp tongue. I remember him saying that Al Gore was so stiff, his Secret Service code name was Al Gore. The hardest thing is to confront confirmation bias in ourselves. It would be very difficult for me, to be honest, to praise good things and important things accomplished by Donald Trump. I will let you know if it ever happens. All of us have the tendency to see an enemy when we really need a mirror. We also see an enemy when we really need a certain kind of friend. For me, it has been important to have friends with deeply different views than my own. It demonstrates that deep disagreements can also be honest disagreements, and it helps expose when I'm guilty of groupthink. Here I'll borrow an idea from the Christian author C.S. Lewis. He talked of the need for what he calls first friends and second friends. Quote, "The first friend," he said, "is the alter ego, the man who first reveals to you that you are not alone in the world, by turning out beyond all hope to share all your most secret delights. But the second friend is the man who disagrees with you about everything. Of course, he shares your interests, otherwise he would not be your friend at all. But he has approached them all at a different angle. He has read all the right books, but got the wrong thing out of every one of them. And then you go at it, hammer and tong, far into the night, night after night, or walking through fine country that neither gives glance to, each learning the weight of each other's punches, and often more like mutually respecting enemies than friends. Actually, though it never seems so at the time, you modify one another's thought. Out of this perpetual dogfight, a community of mind and a deep affection emerges. In this time of division, mistrust, and motivated reasoning, all of us could use more second friends. My third point, the frightening destination of our divided politics is dehumanization. Words can provide permission for prejudice. There is life and death, the scriptures say, in the power of the tongue. I have a friend at the University of Pennsylvania, a researcher named Emil Bruno, who has been studying the politics of the country of Hungary. Emil has devised a disturbing scale to measure blatant dehumanization. In September of 2014, a sample of Hungarians was asked to place Muslim migrants somewhere on the familiar Ascent of Man scientific illustration, the one showing the gradual development from ape to Homo sapiens. Not long afterwards, the right-wing populist government stepped up its anti-immigrant rhetoric and built a barbed wire fence across the border with Serbia to keep refugees out of the country. After this controversy, the same survey was conducted. The level of dehumanization in Hungary had doubled. He concluded violent and dehumanizing political rhetoric can increase support for violence among people already predisposed towards aggression. There's no denying that some politicians of our time have used dehumanization, refugees as animals, Mexican migrants as rapists, Muslims as threats, as a political tool. And there is no denying that hateful political rhetoric can give permission for prejudice. It acts as a psychological lubricant, says David Livington Smith, dissolving our inhibitions and inflaming destructive passions. As such, it empowers us to perform acts that would, under normal circumstances, be unthinkable. The tendency to dehumanize has returned in our history again and again like an ugly rash. And it is always a test of our anthropology, our view of human beings, their rights and dignity, and of whom we welcome in the circle of our care. There are many sources of this commitment, but one of them is faith, a belief that human beings, all of them, the ones we like, the ones we dislike, the ones we hate, the ones we love, are created in God's image. The opposite of dehumanization is humanization. And that's the task I want to focus on as I conclude. We need a journalism that vividly describes worlds that are not our own and invites us to enter them in positive ways. That's a great calling. We need a politics that calls us to the common good, not to the triumph of our tribe. We need religious leaders who emphasize the imago Dei, not the controversy of the day. But a calling also comes to each one of us. One of the greatest lessons of life and one of the deepest lessons of cultural change is the ability of compassion and generosity to break down even thick walls of contempt. When I met the Dalai Lama not too long ago, he talked about the power of, quote, the undiplomatic smile to melt human barriers. There is power in the kind word, the unexpected favor, the genuine compliment. This is the strange alchemy of empathy. We serve our principles best by loving people even more than our principles. This is not flabby or passive. At least it wasn't for Martin Luther King Jr. Quote, love has within it redemptive power, and there is power there that eventually transforms individuals. Just keep being friendly to that person. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. Oh, they react in many ways at the beginning. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more in that transition period. But just keep loving them, and by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. End quote. This is the redeeming value of our moment. Viruses, I think, create their own antibodies. We value more dearly what might be lost. We've had a taste of nihilism and chaos in our society. We've looked into the abyss, and we know this cannot be our destination. I'm confident that people will choose decency and shared progress over the cruel pleasures of blame and spite. And I have seen it happen in important areas, particularly in one story of mass humanization. On this necessity of humanization, Christianity is radical and uncompromising. Faith teaches that everyone matters, that everyone counts, that no insignificant person is ever born. Faith teaches that even desperate prayers are heard and heeded, that even quiet, unnoticed deaths disturb the cosmos. This is not just a private moral matter. It is what political scientist Glenn Tinder calls the major premise of all Christian social and political thinking, the concept of the exalted individual. It is rooted in the universality of God's agape love. It means there is a spiritual destiny for every soul carried into limitless time. It involves the recognition that all of us, even you, even me, even everyone, share a legacy of dignity and worth. There are many elements of the Christian faith that have no political significance. Christian soteriology and Christian eschatology are hugely important, but they usually have no proper place in public life. Yet Christian anthropology, a transcendent vision of human rights, has grabbed men and women in every generation by the collar and never let them go. The Lord Shaftesbury's, the Wilberforces, the Dorothy Days, the MLKs, they all carried the same message of human worth, a message that all of us have significance, not because of what we know, but because we are known, not because of what we achieve, but because we are loved, known by God, loved by God, valued and welcomed by God, across every race, across every border, across every division. The Christian tradition has rich resources of reflection on the principle of human worth. In the history of Christian thought, a concern for human dignity is expressed and completed by a commitment to the common good. John Chrysostom wrote, "This is the rule of the most perfect Christianity, its most exact definition, its highest point, namely the seeking of the common good. For nothing can so make a person an imitator of Christ as caring for his neighbors." That's easier stated than achieved. Serving the common good at home and abroad is not merely a matter of intentions. It requires knowledge and prudence. As any development expert, for example, will tell you, it is possible to hurt with the helping hand. The wrong kind of food aid can undermine local markets. The wrong kind of foreign assistance can crop up corrupt elites. And yet I know that the compassion and generosity of America can make a difference in the world. Around the year 2000, when I began my time in government, the global AIDS crisis was a cresting wave of death across Africa. In the worst affected countries, life expectancy had fallen by 20 years. Walking in South African shanty towns, you would mainly see grandparents and their grandchildren. Much of the intervening generation had simply been swept away. Millions of people were dying at the same time, and yet in total isolation, surrounded by the barbed wire of stigma. I remember visiting one orphanage in Addis with more than 100 neat beds, all for HIV-positive children. For more than a decade, the sisters could only hold the hands of the children as they died. Not a single one survived. Some of the infants were blinded by infections. Some of them, I was told, asked the sisters, "Why can't you come with me where I'm going? Why do I have to go alone?" But I sat in the Oval Office and watched President George W. Bush make the decision to approve the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the largest initiative to fight a single disease in human history. And I saw the results. Once the AIDS drugs started arriving, no children died in that Addis orphanage. I saw infants who had their sight restored. I met children who had come back from the brink of death like Lazarus. It is the closest I have ever come to seeing the wonders of the New Testament with my own eyes. When the president announced PEPFAR in 2003, there were perhaps 50,000 people on AIDS treatment in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Today, thanks to PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and the increasing contributions of countries themselves, there are more than 18 million people on treatment. 18 million people busy with living, people who have lived to hold and care for their children, people who may die as grandparents or great-grandparents, surrounded and honored by the ones they shaped and loved over a lifetime. This effort has created an unusual movement of conscience. The coalition that supported PEPFAR and now supports health and development more broadly is unique in my political experience. It includes congressional champions from the Democratic and Republican parties. It reaches across two very different administrations, both the Bush and the Obama years. No other cause I know involves more genuine agreement from such diverse ideological perspectives. For 15 years, a varied group of people has been rallied to the global common good. People of every background have come together and demonstrated an alternative to the pervasive bitterness of our politics. On this topic, we have seen the opposite of a culture war, a political peace that has helped save millions of lives. This movement again and again has demonstrated something important to our democracy. It is still possible for people with deep disagreements to find common moral purposes when they rally to the principle of human dignity. The success of this effort points to the tremendous importance of advocacy. I know the term makes some people nervous. It shouldn't. Every American, whether they realize it or not, starts with a tremendous historical advantage, a voice in the affairs of the strongest, wealthiest nation on earth. They can leverage their citizenship to serve a universal ideal of human rights and dignity. I'm privileged to see this type of effort every day at ONE, where millions of members in North America, Europe, and Africa provide a voice for the vulnerable in the affairs of this world. I'm constantly encouraged by the idealism of volunteers from every background. ONE has been successful because it is meticulously bipartisan, relentlessly upbeat, and oriented toward hope rather than fear. It is not a religious organization, but it honors the essential role of religious people in advancing the common good. It is truly a common ground organization seeking the global common good, and I am proud to be part of it, and I'm glad to see that a ONE chapter is starting at Wheaton. In our faith tradition, there's currently a lot of emphasis on issues related to religious liberty, and that is essential. The freedom to maintain institutional identity is important. But if religious institutions are known primarily for the defense of their own rights, they will become one interest group among many, and they will fail at the most fundamental level. The main focus of faithful social engagement is not pluralism, it is personalism. Religious people should be known above all for belief in the priority of human beings, their rights and health and dignity. Especially at a time of narrow nationalism, people of faith have a special duty to express the wideness of God's mercy. The activism of faithful people has never been more important. Much about the future justice of the world will be decided by the quality of their conscience. I know I've covered a lot of ground, but let me end with one more story from my time in government. I'm sure that many of you have had the experience of trying to help someone and finding they have more to offer you than you could ever possibly give. When I consider the AIDS crisis, I think of a man named Moses, whom I met in a terrible slum in Kampala, Uganda. He had been on the edge of death, his immune system nearly destroyed by AIDS. At this time, many people died, rejected and alone, but Moses was one of the first Ugandans to receive AIDS drugs through PEPFAR, essentially coming back from the edge of death. Moses gave lectures at schools on, quote, living a life of purpose, trying to break the stigma and silence surrounding AIDS. When I visited the one-room shack where he lived, I saw the charts he used, urging, love your neighbor, pray daily, take care of your body. He served his neighbor. He served the common good. At the end of our talk, he simply said, "I'm a Christian. Will you pray with me?" And with our eyes closed, he began to sing a praise song I did not know. May the Spirit of the Lord come down. May the power of the Lord come down. May the healing of the Lord come down. And then a simple prayer in which Moses called down God's blessings on me. And I felt the power of that blessing, which closed all the distance between us. You can never be too careful when you travel. You can go in search of disease and poverty and stumble upon holy ground. And you can find resilience, courage, and faithfulness that will inspire you and challenge you for the rest of your life. Moses demonstrated that even in our bleakest midnight moments, these can be used and transformed into a life of purpose. Moses would call this grace, which is as good a word as any. The cause of human dignity is ultimately the cause of life and joy. It is the side of inclusion and generosity. And it is a cause that everyone can join in service to a city without boundaries and to a God who values us all. Thank you very much. Now, we have time allotted for questions, and I would love to take them. And I'm happy to go the range of issues. I had to sit through the emotional roller coaster of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings for the PBS coverage. I've been at the center of a lot of these debates, but I also very much wanted to talk about this set of issues as well, and what's going on in evangelicalism, which disturbs me and I write about often. But I'd love to get questions. Sure, please.
Are there any books that you would recommend in general and specifically in this time in political climate?
Do you find especially encouraging to you in the direction of willingness to think with your partner's mind, your opponent's mind?
Two good questions. One of them is what I find encouraging, and the other one is what books that I might recommend. What I find encouraging is that there are still a number of issues, like the issues that I talked about tonight, where you can still find ideological common ground. The range of those issues has narrowed over the years as issue after issue has been pulled into a polarization machine. But when I have spent time, for example, with E.J. Dionne, my colleague at the Post, talking about, say, issues of poverty, we find significant common ground. I did a few years ago an effort with Jim Wallace of Sojourners. We have very different politics. But we put together a series of public policy experts to find from left and right what we could agree on to help the poor, and came up with more than a dozen serious proposals that would have allowed us to move forward and were generally ignored by the Congress. So it's not as though these things are impossible. I mean, there are efforts in which this works. Our system can still work under the right circumstances, but to be completely honest, it's been a difficult time. I've spent the last 25 or 30 years of my life on one project in one way or another, which is trying to give the party of the center-right in American politics a message of social justice rooted in Christian concepts. And that project is pretty much in ruins. That doesn't mean that's forever. I mean, we always look at our moment and think it's permanent. But it's not an easy one from a lot of different perspectives. I am in the process of writing my own book when it comes to. So I'm doing a lot of reading in the history of Christian social engagement. Some of them are in the African American prophetic tradition. Jesus and the Dispossessed is a good book. Some of them are sources, readings in Catholic social thought, which I think evangelicals should take a look at. There are a variety of books that make that more accessible. There are sources that I'm reading in the social gospel, which are actually worth reading as well, Rauschenbusch and others, who had a different take. And then there are just extraordinary models of evangelical conviction, particularly from the 19th century in both Britain and the United States, that I'm finding just tremendously inspiring. And some of that is just going back and looking at old biographies of people like Josephine Butler, who was one of the most prominent 19th century British reformers, a woman, evangelical, middle class, who became known as the patron saint of the prostitutes. She fought against the sexual double standard between men and women in Victorian society in a very courageous way, whereby women were condemned for engaging in sex work and men were not for consuming it. She campaigned against hygiene laws that allowed the police to do gynecological examinations on any woman within 10 kilometers of a military base. It was an extraordinary thing. She just took some of the most difficult issues to talk about that you can possibly imagine and brought a vivid Christian conviction to bear, and a kind of compassionate spirit. There are a couple of good biographies of her. The book I'm putting together, which is provisionally called The Higher Call, is going to profile a number of Christian figures who represent a different model of social engagement from the one we're seeing right now in modern Christianity more broadly. Not just going to be evangelicals, but many of them evangelicals, also Catholics. People like Frederick Douglass, who was an extraordinary, intense Christian, who had a profound critique of the white church in both the North and the South. Whose entire career was really motivated by his faith. And so there are a number of these figures that when you get into them, and I hope other people will find the same thing, that when you find these examples of conscience, it can really change your views, give you models. I found that a lot at Wheaton with people like Blanchard and other abolitionist leaders and Charles Finney and that great generation. But it's even deeper than that. Early figures in feminism that were evangelical in the United States. Figures in the temperance movement like Lyman Beecher, who is a great evangelical hero. So right now, unfortunately, I've got a list of like 30 people that I'm interested in and have done research on, but I'll probably have to get it down to like 12 or something. So hopefully that book will be out next year. Yeah, please.
You talked a lot about practicing politics for the common good internationally, but how do we do that at home in the United States?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I would tell you, and I don't want it to sound like a cop-out, is look to the state legislatures. Washington is pretty tough right now when it comes to education policy or welfare policy or anything like that. We did a big tax cut, which some support I generally like. But when it comes to specific policies to address social concerns, we're not seeing much. Some on the opioid crisis, but it's not a creative period at the federal level. But then you find at the state level, things like juvenile justice reform, that provide alternatives to incarceration, particularly for young people, and find more creative ways to do punishment and rehabilitation. And you have, action on those issues in places like Texas and Georgia, very conservative places. So I think that there's a lot there. I think there's practical things at the local level that can be done, opposing payday lending, for example, having principles stand against the extension of gambling, which is a terrible theft from the poor. So there are a number of issues out there where people are making progress and having some results. There are a significant number of governors that are doing a good job and building consensus. Governor of Maryland is a Republican in a Democratic state. Governor CACE in Ohio has done a great job. I mean, there's Governor Hickenlooper has, on a number of things in Colorado, has done a good job. And so, I guess I would urge, if you're looking for good examples, I would look at the state level in a lot of places. Sure, how about right here is fine. We'll get both of you, it's fine.
The incentives seem to favor increased polarization of the parties, and that seems to be still trending worse. Where do you see us going, and what might it take, or what do you anticipate happening before we start changing course?
The short term is fairly disturbing, in my view. We no longer have a party of the center right at the national level in American politics. Okay, the Republican Party has been almost completely and swiftly transformed. And I think it's quite possible that after the next election, we will no longer have a party of the center left in American politics because of the direction of the Democratic Party. And that will turn that conflict between the functional equivalent of Bernie Sanders and the functional equivalent of Donald Trump into a polarization machine. That is not going to be a productive national argument. I don't expect it to be Sanders, but I expect it to be someone from the left, a person of the left. And so it's not going to be edifying. I guess the hopeful thing is that parties tend to change eventually when they lose. So in 2000, when I was involved in George W. Bush's presidential campaign, we'd had 8 years of the Obama administration, and the Republican Party was ready to have a more moderate Republican who could try to win an election. Okay, and it was, we ran as compassionate conservative, and we tried to do outreach to women and Catholics and Hispanics and a lot of different groups, and actually made some significant progress on those groups, and including up to 2004. But that was not the mood of the party in 2016. And the question, parties do not reform until they lose. And so I think it will take a midterm repudiation on the part of the Republican Party, a serious midterm repudiation. I hope we have a Democratic House as a check on the president. I've never wished that in my entire life before. I'm a pretty strong Republican. But it's, So I don't know. It's going to be. I guess I would say that the short-term prognosis is not good, but parties eventually change when they don't have any other option. And I think we could be on that path. I'm confident we are, but I don't know how long it's going to take. Looks good. Mm-hmm.
So, in reading the Founding Fathers' documents, it seems as though they had a pretty fundamental understanding of the sinful nature of man. And
Who? I'm sorry?
The Founding Fathers.
Yeah.
And it seems as though they tried to build a government that reflected that. And fast forward to today, and it seems both on a national level as well as even in personal conversations, I run into a lot of people that are not willing to recognize the idea of truth, much less sin.
Yeah.
So how do we build a nation when we have such fundamentally different ideas of the nature of man?
Yeah, it's tough. The founders had a kind of complex view. They saw man as fallen and sinful, and they used that in a kind of almost an Enlightenment machine to balance ambition against ambition to try to limit power. Okay, and that has been a very successful system. But at least the Federalist founders, and most of the others as well, also believed that that a republic could not function without republican virtue. The idea that people had to believe in the common good, had to be willing to sacrifice for their fellows, that had to, exhibit certain democratic virtues in order to make democracy work. And they thought religion was very important in supplying those virtues that were necessary for democratic self-government. I mean, on the theory, I think the good theory that people can't govern their country until they can govern themselves. So that's kind of a mix. They believed in both the necessity of virtue and the inevitability of evil. And that was a worldview that was rooted in both the Enlightenment tradition, which really the balancing, the Madisonian kind of approach was an Enlightenment approach in a lot of ways, and a kind of more Judeo-Christian tradition. It was a confluence of those philosophic traditions. And neither of them are particularly healthy in our common life right now. But I guess the way that I would, put this is, I'm afraid about the decline of trust in institutions for a specific reason. I look at something like, I worked in the Senate on and off for 10 years, and I love the Senate. I love its traditions and its practices and procedures and history. They're all difficult and complicated and frustrating, purposely frustrating. And I look at what's happened in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and none of it matters. All of it is the will to power. All of it is outcomes. No one respects procedures. No one respects anything except winning. And that is a tough thing in a democracy. You have to have a certain level of trust in institutions in order to make self-government work. So I think we've had a crisis of confidence in a set of Republican virtues, but also in a willingness to defer to the authority of important institutions. I think the founders would have believed in their wisdom that if you just have a completely individualistic society where everyone is out for themselves, no one cares for their neighbor, where the only thing that matters is your tribal outcome, that that is not going to be effective self-government. You can't have effective self-government under those circumstances. So, I think there are some serious philosophic issues faced by our form of government right now. I'd mention one that I touched on, obviously, in the speech, but I think that our American society, as much as at any time that I've seen, needs a Christian anthropology, needs a Christian view of human beings, their rights and dignity, as opposed to a utilitarian view, the greatest good for the greatest number, a view that the justice of a society is measured by the treatment of the weakest members of that society. That is not a natural position in human societies through most of history. That is not unique, but a particular contribution of Christians in Western history, this view of individuals, their rights and dignity. And that's what, without going into it, that's what bothers me about when Christians in public act like one interest group among many, instead of people that are oriented towards the good of the whole and towards the value of the weak. I'm afraid, I think evangelicals have played into that in many ways, and a lot of Catholics as well. But I think there's a need right now, kind of a crying need for a rooted belief in human dignity. And I hope people realize how important it is to rise to that challenge right now. Can we go over here?
I've lived in Europe with its multi-parties, and it occurs to me that building a big enough tent is almost impossible. You have the far right, the center right, the liberal left, the far left, and the Greens in Austria. Would that be a solution?
Well, to some extent. I was just in Berlin for a little while and then in Saxony, and looking at the German situation. And there's a far-right party that's rising in that society, particularly in the areas of the East. The good thing is that even though they're going to be larger than people probably think, but they haven't taken over one of the major parties. Okay, they essentially are a minority movement that has their own party. From my perspective, and it may be controversial, that I think that we saw pretty much a relatively small portion of the Republican Party take over the party completely in the last election. Okay, instead of forming their own small party, the nativist, ethno-nationalist party, there was essentially an internal coup, a democratic coup, by which one element of the party, a relatively small one, took over the entire party, and came to Washington and didn't even have enough people to put in positions because they had no developed political movement. There was no cadre of people in think tanks. There was nobody. So that's sobering. Would it be better to have smaller parties with certain worldviews more directly represented? I don't know. Germany has actually had a fairly stable politics when it had two big umbrella parties. That was actually a good thing for the country, for the more stable system. And that's what's dying in a lot of places. is the ability to have ideological umbrella parties. And so is that dying in the United States? I mean, that's a question that a lot of people are asking, particularly on the center-right in America. It's like, can this institution be reformed? Can it be returned to certain values? Or do you have to pursue change outside of that, the two-party system? And I think it's an open question right now. But I think it will be a more urgent question if the president is reelected, because essentially his control of the party by the end of 8 years would be pretty much complete, and he might be able to choose his own successor. And a two-term president is very different. Under that circumstance, would people like me stay? I don't know. It would be tough. I mean,
build coalitions when you have those types of parties, and it's kind of more like a parliamentary system as opposed to ours.
well, you look at effectively the House caucus, the House Republican caucus had 30 or 40 members that were not Republicans. They were the Freedom Party, caucus, okay? They could essentially deny Republican leader, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, a victory every time. And he would have to go and get Democratic support in order to pass anything if they didn't want it passed. And that was a coalition of sorts. I mean, you had to please a party. I mean, it was essentially a separate party, all but name. But it ruined the lives of, Boehner and Ryan, and made their lives just miserable. I actually feel sorry for them both. It's an almost impossible situation to be in. So, who's next? Let me go back here.
To what extent do you think the 2016 election is part of like a larger global trend towards nationalism?
Yeah. I think there is a relationship. I think some of it has to do with the costs of globalization on relatively vulnerable economic groups, okay? You see that in Germany with people, low-skilled people, Saxony is very much like West Virginia, and a lot of the same dynamics are there, and a turn to, a turn against trade, a turn to a more nationalist foreign policy, more, assertive national identity. I think that there is some similarity there. But some of what's going on in Europe has its own roots as well. It's really rooted in the fact that the world allowed the implosion of Syria and the development of the largest movement of refugees and internally displaced persons since World War II. You had a situation in Germany where, in an act of moral leadership, which was also an act of political suicide, maybe, you had the Chancellor of Germany allow in 1 million Muslim refugees, and in just a year or two. The United States, in that same period, cut our refugee allotments. I went to the Dachau region of Germany, which is, of famous name, that met with their local CDU representatives, who was also a local official, who was taking care of their refugee effort. And this county of Dachau took more Syrian refugees than the United States did that year. But there's been a significant backlash. And then you build on that the backlash of Muslim migration in Great Britain and in France. And some of it is their own, an internal dynamic, not necessarily a global one. On the globalization side, I think we just have to take a balanced view. Over the last 20 years, the last 2 decades, more than 1 billion people have been taken out of extreme poverty in the world. It is the largest humanitarian economic progress in human history. It's taken place mainly in China and India, but it's been just an extraordinary human achievement. But one of the costs of that has been to cause a dynamic in developed markets like the United States that puts a premium on higher skilled labor, that destroys some traditional industries, and causes a significant amount of dislocation. Some people can be retrained, and some people will never be retrained, and you have to take both of those seriously. So it's kind of the flip side of one of the great revolutions in human history. So it's a complicated, globalization is a very complicated development, and most of the world views it quite differently than we do. So without going into it all, I think in the United States you had a group of economically displaced people because of rapid economic change. I think you had a group of people that felt like the commanding heights of our culture were condescending towards their values, so kind of cultural condescension. And then I think you had a group of people that saw the multicultural face in America and didn't like it. And that's more disturbing. And there's a lot of overlap between those groups, but all of it was, kind of came together in something that was much larger than I thought it would be in the U.S. Who do we want next? Maybe over here?
Alrighty. So for you as a person of faith, how are you able to keep yourself as a man of integrity in a world where many seem to think the only path to success is by using people as stepping stones or by cutting corners?
To some extent, I wish I had a story of persecution, but I've actually had a pretty good situation. I worked right out of college, right out of Wheaton, was hired by Chuck Colson, the leader of Prison Fellowship, one of the great social reformers of the 20th century. And Chuck was my mentor and friend, and I was with him for close to 3 years. Then I went to work on and off for a decade for Dan Coates of Indiana, who was one of the most decent human beings I've ever met. Then I went down and worked early in a presidential campaign for George W. Bush, and we get along really well, and I have a lot of respect for him. And now I work at the Washington Post, where I can pretty much write anything I'd like, and I work at the One campaign, which is not a faith-based organization, but a faith-friendly organization, where I feel very much at home. So people that think you go to Washington and you go to these highly secular environments, it was just not my experience. Even the time I spent as a straight reporter at U.S. News and World Report for a while as a senior editor at U.S. News and World Report, I developed friendship with journalists that are still close friends, and I was treated really well. I just don't have horror stories. So it's easier in those environments. But it's still not easy in the sense that there's a significant amount of pressure in these jobs, and it can lead you toward God or away from him. When I was at the White House, I had an intensification of religious experience. I actually spent a significant amount of time up at the National Cathedral and the chapels there, and developed a more kind of contemplative prayer life. It's one of my favorite places in the world. You know, took to journaling and wrote in my journal that I thought that God was preparing me for something large, maybe even for death. And I had a heart attack in 2004. And I went into the hospital, you know, with serious chest pain, completely at peace. And I'm not sure that would happen right now if I did that. But it was pretty extraordinary how God prepares you for what you need to be prepared for. And I've developed in Washington good, small groups. I have an exceptional book group that I meet with of just amazing Christian people. I have a close friendship with a man named Pete Weiner, who is at Ethics and Public Policy Center. You should look at his writing if you haven't seen it. He writes for the New York Times sometimes and other places. And we talk twice a day. I have a close kind of, very strong Christian friend. But even then, I find that you go through peaks and valleys in your spiritual life that seem to run on their own course, so. More questions? Okay. I think you've been patient here.
Uh-huh. You touched on it a couple of times, so I thought I would give you a chance to elaborate if you'd like, and that is on the credit or the blame that's given to evangelical voters for the turn in our, or the current status in our government. Mm-hmm. I'm being real broad on that.
Yeah, well, I don't want to be too harsh. I did a cover story in the Atlantic magazine on evangelicals and Trump, where I developed these views at length. I have a column out that actually came out tonight for tomorrow's newspaper, which once again calls into question the deal that's being made by many evangelical leaders in particular, that says for this set of policies and favors and benefits, I will ignore certain normative matters of ethics and principle, and tolerate racial language and misogyny. From one perspective, the people that have made that deal have gotten much of what they were promised. So, when it comes to federal judges, when it comes to the Supreme Court, when it comes to a lot of these things. But I think in the long run, it's not a good deal. I think that, for example, the pro-life movement, I'm strongly pro-life, is not going to benefit in the long run from being associated with a political movement that welcomes misogyny. I think it'll discredit the arguments that are essential to broader social persuasion. And I look at the way that, serious, normally non-hostile, non-believers view evangelicals fundamentally as hypocrites in our society. And that it disturbs me. The reality here is sometimes I look in the polling and just pull my hair out. It's Christians are the most hostile group in America to refugees in the polling. It makes no sense to me whatsoever, given their biblical, example and their tradition. It's infuriating. You have, as I make clear in my column tomorrow, You have Jerry Falwell praising the president for his strong leadership. The same week that they found under cover of night that they're bringing 13,000 unaccompanied minor migrant children to a prison camp on the Texas border in one of the greatest scandals of modern American history. And I don't hear Christians talking about it. I just, even commenting on it. And there's just, there's a problem of priorities that I just am having a tough time understanding. All that said, I went through the 2016 election, and I do not believe that this was an easy choice between the two presidential candidates in that race. I don't think I have to claim that it was. But that's very different from becoming sycophants for the president. I mean, you couldn't vote for him and then hold him to account on issues of human dignity. Why not? And of course, the reason why not is because people don't want to compromise their access and influence. And that's not a good reason. So, you know, I think in the long term, it's not going to work out well. I think the way the culture is going to view conservative Christianity, you know, the next administration, the next Democratic administration, is going to view evangelical Christians the same way that the ACLU is viewed by the current administration, as fundamental enemies. And, you know, instead of being a force calling for, you know, calling everyone to account in our politics when they fail according to, you know, Christian standards, you know, I think evangelicals have joined one side of the culture war as a political movement, and are going to be treated like that for a long time to come. And that is not, that's not their tradition at its best. I love I look a lot at the 19th century, and I look at the role, you know, you had a political class in American life that had compromise after compromise trying to prevent a civil war, and that was actually a very useful governing purpose. But you also had Northern evangelicals, abolitionists, who said in the background of this debate, the Constitution of the United States is not consistent with the gospel, because it demeans human beings, and forced the country to recognize an issue of human dignity that it couldn't ignore. And you know, it would be great if I saw more of that in our current politics. And I think it would be good for the witness of Christianity if that happened. Well, thank you all very much. It was good discussion. I really enjoyed it.
So Michael will be back there at that desk that says 1 on it. So if you want to speak with him, he will be back there. You'll also have the opportunity, as was mentioned earlier, to have some information, some letter writing about political campaigns. So thank you so much for coming. I hope this has been informative for you, and hopefully it catalyzes you to be agents for the common good. Thank you for coming.